So on this November 26, 2015, I'm going to tell you the truth about the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. Napoleon Bonaparte once said, history is a myth that men agree to believe. So history is just a book of lies that we all agree upon. Or is there an objective reality? I think that there's an objective reality. Something either did or did not happen. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 3. William Bradford, the first governor of Plymouth Colony. John Carver was actually the first governor, but he dies really quick. And William Bradford's the governor for like 30 years, minus like 5. But William Bradford is the man when it comes to the Pilgrims. So William Bradford, the main governor of Plymouth Colony, first elected governor once that John Carver, who wrote the Mayflower Compact. John Carver was the first signer of the Mayflower Compact. So John Carver was the first governor. But William Bradford was the first main elected governor. So William Bradford, the governor of the Plymouth Colony for about 30 years, it eventually failed, but William Bradford started out as an orphan boy from Yorkshire. He was an orphan. William Bradford was a Brownist separatist. He wasn't a Puritan. William Bradford and company suffered religious persecution in England because their church taught that they should annoy the hell out of their neighbors. William Bradford was an over-religious zealot who thought that only his interpretation of the Bible was right and fuck everybody else. The non-Puritan Bradford was anti-Catholic. He hated the Pope. Bradford hated the bishops. William Bradford hated the priest. He even hated the church buildings themselves. Who hates a building? William Bradford did. For William Bradford, all that one needed in order to be a good Christian was a group of people who worshiped together in the name of Jesus. And that was it. For William Bradford, wherever folks met in the name of God and Jesus Christ, that's all that mattered. William Bradford and company then sneaked away to Amsterdam, where they were able to freely practice their religion as they chose. But while in the Netherlands, William Bradford and company discovered that the Netherlands contained a lot of Dutch people and Dutch culture. So they said, fuck this, and set on out for Massachusetts. So he was able to freely worship. They didn't go to America for religious freedom. They went to the Netherlands for religious freedom. But while they were in the Netherlands, William Bradford, he didn't like the liberal Dutch culture. He was losing control over his children. His children were doing whatever they want to do, and it scared him. He wanted to teach them a particular way, and the Dutch culture was more liberal, so they were, running around doing the Dutch stuff. The marijuana is legal in the Netherlands. I don't know if it was legal then, it is now. But they explained that William Bradford was very proud of his English heritage. Even though England was being run by a bunch of corrupt fornicators and merrymakers. So it seems like the main reason was to control his children. He really wanted to control his children. He loved England, but England was run by people that didn't allow him to practice his own religion. When they wrote the Mayflower Compact, they gave all glory to the King James. So essentially they came to America because they wanted a conservative English culture where they can have 100% total control over their children. So it wasn't religious freedom. They wanted religious freedom, but they got the religious freedom in the Netherlands. And they wanted to control their children's lives as helicopter parents, and the Netherlands wasn't giving them that opportunity. Of the 102 original pilgrims on board the Mayflower, 40 of them were called saints, Well, they called themselves the saints, religious zealots. And then the other 60 or so, the majority were adventurers, speculators, servants, which the saints called strangers. So there was actually more adventurers and speculators and servants than they were, religious zealots. On the Mayflower, there was a total of 70 women and men, 30 children, a bunch of chickens, and a dog. They took them 65 days to cross the stormy Atlantic in a space the size of a city bus. So it took a really long 65 days on the Atlantic Ocean, in 1620. Times are different back then. William Bradford and the Mayflower landed at what is now Provincetown Harbor, Massachusetts, in November 1620. Provincetown Harbor. 2 of the pilgrims had died on the boat ride over. 1 baby was born. Also, Bradford and all the pilgrims were illegal. They were illegal aliens. They didn't have a visa to get into this country. They didn't go through customs. They weren't vetted like the Syrian refugees are going to be vetted. The pilgrims didn't assimilate into the New World culture. They didn't learn to speak Algonquin or Iroquois or Yuchi or the language of the Wampanoag/Pokanoket. The pilgrims didn't try. They didn't even try to. They said, this is our culture, this is who we are, we're English Christians, we come to your country and we're going to establish our way of life, and eventually we're probably going to take over all of you all. The Mayflower didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The Plymouth Rock myth landed on us as kids when our public school teachers fed us that bullshit. The Plymouth Rock myth was just a public relations stunt created by locals to increase tourism. So the Mayflower didn't land on Plymouth Rock, and like what Mark Twain said, a lie, especially a really good lie, can encircle the globe before the truth even has a chance to put its pants on. Other myths about the pilgrims, they didn't all just wear a bunch of black. They didn't wear those buckles, the buckles in their hats and the buckles on their shoes, or those black steeple hats. They didn't wear any of that. That was, some people were wearing that in England, and so historians at a later date just ascribed the English dress to the pilgrims, assuming that they had dressed the same way. Pilgrims actually had very colorful clothing and dressed varied. They dressed in lots of different ways. In 1605, a British expedition led by Captain George Weymouth had landed on this particular coastline where the pilgrims land, on Provincetown. When they left in 1614, George Weymouth, they took 24 natives as slaves and left smallpox, syphilis, and gonorrhea in their wake. STDs. One of the natives taken back to Europe was Tisquantum, and Tisquantum means divine rage, but the white man called Tisquantum Squanto. Pocahontas saved John Smith in order to free John Smith up to enslave all the Patuxent and the Nauset natives that he could capture. Some say John Smith was the one who captured Squanto, since Squanto was a part of John Smith's ship. So did he get kidnapped by both George Weymouth earlier and then John Smith later? Did he get kidnapped and enslaved 2 times? It's possible. Nobody really knows. The Pilgrims settled in an area that was once Patuxent, and the Patuxents were Wampanoags. And Wampanoags are also called Pokanoket. Pokanoket. So the Pokanokets and Wampanoags are the exact same thing. Pokanoket, Wampanoags, they're just synonymous words. Pokanoket is the main tribe for all the Wampanoags, but I haven't seen an explanation for what the difference is. I don't know if one's an autonym and an anonym or what the deal is there, but Patuxents are both. Patuxents were the Wampanoags and the Pokanokets. So Patuxents, Squanto, were Massasoit, Chief Massasoit, Metacom, and Wamsutta, that whole family there. Before 1616, the Wampanoag numbered 50,000 to 100,000. They occupied 69 villages scattered throughout southeastern Massachusetts and eastern Rhode Island. Disease, murder, slavery wiped out nearly two-thirds of the Pokanoket Wampanoags before the Pilgrims even got there. When John Carver, William Bradford, and the rest of the Pilgrims landed on Squanto's family's ancestral homeland, Patuxent, and Squanto was the last of the Patuxents. Once he went to England, he was captured and enslaved, come back, all his family was gone. They were dead. John Smith called the land of Patuxent New Plymouth. The land of Patuxent is called Provincetown today. The land of Patuxent didn't have anybody there. And the Pilgrims took that as God's message to them to settle this land. God cleared the land out and had all those other white people murder, spread disease, enslaving everybody. So God allowed that to happen to clear the Patuxent lands so that William Bradford and the Pilgrims could settle there. So that was nice of God to do that for the Pilgrims, not very nice of them to do that to the Patuxent people. While they didn't see any natives on Squanto's family's ancestral homeland of Patuxent, they did find a bunch of graves. And so naturally, they robbed the graves. One colonist said, the next morning we found a place like a grave. We decided to dig it up. We found first a mat, and under that, a fine bow. We also found bowls, trays, dishes, things like that. We took several of the prettiest things to carry away with us and covered the body up again. The Puritans survived by stealing the food stores of neighboring native summer villages, as well as eating corn that was still grown wild from abandoned cornfields near the ruined village. Following that came a cruel New England winter for which they were ill prepared. The Pilgrims faced rampant disease, starvation, and death at the Plymouth colony, and to ward off attacks by the natives, the Pilgrims would drag their dead out into the woods, prop them up against a tree with a musket in their hand so that it would appear that they were sentries. It looked like they were, had defenses. That's what the Pilgrims did with their dead. They took their dead and propped them up on a tree. More than half of the 102 passengers of the Mayflower died in the first 3 months, wiping out 5 entire families. 5 whole families had died in the first 3 months, and no family was left intact, and they were all grieving. William Bradford's first wife, Dorothy Bradford, she is said to have just fallen overboard and drowned, but due to everybody dying and starving, some people think it could have been suicide coming out of despair. The Plymouth Plantation was a London-based corporation, a company set up to make some rich paymasters some money, none of which risked the journey to America, since many of the Pilgrims came to find riches. They weren't suitable to survive in the winter months. Speculators, zealots, these are not, the adventurers. Adventurers make more sense. But they came looking for wealth, land, gold, but they're incompetent. They didn't know how to raise crops. They didn't know how to hunt, nor did they know how to survive. That's why over half of the first 100 Pilgrims died in the first year. And it wasn't even the first year. It was the first 3 months. William Bradford, being a strict Protestant, also didn't celebrate Christmas the first, second, or any of the years that he was, running Plymouth Colony. There's a story on December 25th, 1621, and this is after the first so-called Thanksgiving. But William Bradford led a work detail into the forest and discovered some recent arrivals among the crew had scruples about working on the day that the Lord was born. William Bradford noted this in his history of the colony on Plymouth Plantation. On the day called Christmas Day, the governor called the settlers out to work, as was usual. However, most of this new crew excused themselves and said it went against their conscience to work on that day. So the governor told them that if they made it a matter of conscience, he would spare them till they were better informed. And he led away the rest and left them. When the governor's crew returned home at noon, they discovered those left behind were playing stool ball, pitching the bar, and other crazy sport names that I've never heard of. William Bradford confiscated their implements, reprimanded them, forbade any further reveling in the streets, and told them their devotion for the day should be confined to their homes. Massachusetts and Connecticut followed the Plymouth colony in refusing to condone any observance of Christmas when the Puritans came to power in England. Following the execution of King Charles I, Parliament enacted a law in 1647 abolishing the observance of Christmas, Easter, and Whitsuntide. Whitsuntide used to be a big Christian thing. Check out WHITSUNTIDE, Whitsuntide. The Puritans of New England then passed a series of laws making any observance of Christmas illegal, thus banning Christmas celebrations for part of the 17th century. A Massachusetts law of 1659 punished offenders with a hefty 5-shilling fine. So, I mean, shit, it could have been Christmas that actually pushed William Bradford and the Pilgrims out of the Netherlands. If I had been living in Plymouth in the 1620s and William Bradford and John Carver, who just watched over half of our people die the very first year, the first 3 months, I'd tell Bradford to go fuck off. No, half of the people have just fucking died. I don't want to fucking work today. Not just about, celebrating, but fuck him and his entire authority. You're going to tell me I can't celebrate what I believe, my holiday? And we're all Christians here. I think it's the day of the Lord's birth. What day do you think is his birthday? You don't know? Well, I guess I win because I got the date. In fact, when half the people die, that's a failure. That's a failure of a colony. And then overall, Plymouth colony winds up being a total and complete failure anyways because they abandoned it and they joined the Massachusetts Bay Colony. There's only been 2 sources about the story of Thanksgiving. The actual imagery, the myth, the story, 1621, Pilgrims, Native Americans came together, pumpkin pie and cranberry sauce and all this, just merrymaking, right? Merrymaking, which the Pilgrims, the Separatists, the Zealots, were against, dancing, singing all this. But there's 2 sources that the story of Thanksgiving even comes from. One of them is William Bradford's journal titled A Plymouth Plantation, and then Edward Winslow's Mort's Relations. Edward Winslow's account actually talks about the event, whereas William Bradford's journal only talks about the harvest during the summer and the fall months in a very general sense. So here's William Bradford's 115 words in 5 sentences, supposedly about the, first Thanksgiving. They began now to gather in the small harvest they had, and to fit up their houses and dwellings against winter, being all well recovered in health and strength, and had all things in good plenty. For as some were thus employed in affairs abroad, others were exercised in fishing, about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took good store, of which every family had their portion. All the summer there was no want, and now began to come in store of fowl, as winter approached, of which this place did abound when they first came, but afterwards decreased by degrees. And besides waterfowl, there was great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many, besides venison, etc. Besides, they had about a peck of meal a week to a person, or now since harvest, Indian corn to that proportion, which made many afterwards write so large of their plenty here to their friends in England, which were not feigned but true reports. So that's Thanksgiving. How did any of that, what did any of that have to do with Thanksgiving? So it's just a general, the first year, half people fucking died, but now, look, things are getting better. And so he was just talking about how things were getting better with fishing. The food items that he had mentioned, cod, bass, wild turkeys, fowl is just a bird, right? Cardinal, bluebirds, owls, eagles, and waterfowl, ducks, geese. He said venison, which is deer meat, and Indian corn. So those are the, 5, 6, or 7 food items that were mentioned in a very general sense during the summer and fall 1621. In Bradford's narrative, he doesn't even mention that a huge feast with the Native Americans happened. He just said that 1621 was a better year than 1620, and that during, that summer there was no want of food, so they were getting better and improving. He mentioned the fall harvest, but there was no mention about Chief Massasoit or 90 Native Americans, a huge feast, a day of Thanksgiving, an announcement of a public holiday, prayers, nothing like that was mentioned. Just very general. He said that there was lavish hunting and gathering season, and that's it. So 1621 was a better year than 1620. So in reality, we only have one account of the first supposed Thanksgiving, just Edward Winslow's account. So here's what Edward Winslow had to say about Thanksgiving. Our corn did prove well, and God be praised, we had a good increase of Indian corn, and our barley indifferent good, but our peas not worth the gathering, for we feared they were too late sown. They came up very well and blossomed, but the sun parched them in the blossom. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might after a special manner rejoice together. After we had gathered the fruits of our labors, they 4 in one day killed as much fowl as with little help beside served the company almost a week, at which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms. Many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest, their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. Governor would have been either John Carver or Bradford, and Captain Miles Standish. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God, we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. So, he did mention goodness of God. They're Christians. They talk about, Christianity all the time, but he didn't really get into what that 3-day feast was. He says that they all had gathered, the fruits of their labor. And then he says that they were shooting their guns and they had recreation. And then he says that the natives, the Wampanoag, about 90 of them, including Massasoit, came. So it looks like it's a fall harvest. Then Chief Massasoit just kind of invites himself. He's got 90 men. And then for 3 days, there's a big festival, entertainment, and they feasted. But the Native Americans had to go out and kill 5 deer, so there wasn't enough food for everybody. So it's not even clear if Chief Massasoit was invited. They're, celebrating their fall harvest. They started shooting their guns, and then the Native Americans showed up. Well, why did they show up? Maybe they were skeptical. Why are y'all shooting your guns? Edward Winslow only mentions Indian corn, barley, fowl, deer, and peas that weren't even harvested. So where's the turkey at? Where's the pumpkin pie? Where's the cranberry sauce? He said Indian corn, barley, fowl, which duck, geese, and deer, so white-tailed deer. And those are just things he had mentioned. The deer was the only thing that was actually specifically mentioned. So the only thing we know for sure that was at the first so-called Thanksgiving dinner was white-tailed deer. And that's it. Fowl could be any bird. But when Bradford mentions fowl, he also mentions wild turkeys, which indicates that he looks at wild turkeys as different than fowls. They're not the same. So we can only be sure that white-tailed deer was the only thing at the Thanksgiving, because that's the only food item that Edward Winslow mentions for the 3-day harvest / Day of Peace celebration. Edward Winslow actually mentions the 3-day event specifically, and he also mentions the Wampanoag, Pokanoket, King Massasoit, whereas Bradford didn't even mention their names. And without Massasoit, there is no unity dinner. There is no Thanksgiving. So on a side note, the name Massasoit is actually a title for a great king. Massasoit's actual name was Usamiquin. So Massasoit is king, Massasoit Usamequin. So that would be his whole title, Massasoit Usamequin. Just like Beetlejuice, if you say Usamequin 3 times, he appears, which is why I said it 4 times, because 4 times cancels it. The Pokanoket Wampanoag outright refused to convert and become Christians. Edward Winslow also doesn't mention why Massasoit came, what his purpose was, if he was even he wasn't, it doesn't say that he was invited. And I've read a ton about this. And I also know that Massasoit, after this celebration, agreed to become political and military allies with Miles Standish, Bradford, Carver, the Pilgrims, against other Native American tribes. Also, Massasoit allows Miles Standish and the Pilgrims to live on Patuxent lands. Patuxent used to be Wampanoag. Massasoit is in Wampanoag, and so they were actually on Massasoit's land since the Patuxent were gone. Or Squanto. Squanto was the last Patuxent. So really, that's all his land, right? His ancestral homeland. So the point of the meeting could have been to solidify their friendship, their political and military alliance, and the land deal. So not a huge fall festival, wasn't something that they had invited or had planned, something very spontaneous. I noticed that Edward Winslow talked about recreations, shooting off guns, maybe even cannons, and then that's when the Native Americans came. So here's that passage again. At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercise our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us and amongst the rest of their greatest king, Massasoit, 90 men for whom 3 days we entertained and feasted. They went out, killed 5 deer, which they brought back to the plantation. So just reading that sentence, it's a horrible run-on sentence, but my take is that the Pilgrims are having a fall harvest celebration. They started to shoot their guns and cannons because, that's what white people do. You have a party, you need to shoot some guns and cannons. And the Wampanoag think shenanigans are going on. What the fuck is going on over in the Patuxent lands over there with all them, newcomers? What were they doing? So they came to see what was up. They came to see what's good, to check out the situation. The Wampanoag Pokanoket came with their entire tribe, all 90 of them, locked and loaded, ready to fight. Because that's how Massasoit Usamequin rolls. Usamequin had 90 people on his side. The Pilgrims had 52. The Pilgrims having this fall harvest see Massasoit Usamequin coming up with a superior military force twice their size. So they're like, hey, buddies. They acted real nice and invited the possible invaders in for dinner. Kind of smooth things over. Now it's speculation. There's no specific mention of any purpose for the visit. He wasn't invited, and when Massasoit Usamequin comes, the Wampanoag/Pokanoket then had to go and get more food. The 5 white